Australian who is based in
Yes.
Bristol at the university there, but you're currently in Berlin. Is that correct?
Yeah, well done.
Thanks.
All of the above is true.
And I have been, if people who have been listening to this podcast of mine will know over the past 4 or 5 episodes, this has been the thing I've been looking forward to most of all. So I'm so genuinely grateful that you've chosen to come on board and have a chat with us. And I'm so very excited about having a chat to you about who you are and what you do, and one of the areas of research that you, do you say specialize in, or is it just an area of interest for research for you?
Well, both. I'm interested in it, but I also specialize in it. Yeah.
So you are a psychologist, and I'm assuming that means the psychology department of Bristol. Is that the department you're a professor in?
Yeah, you're right about the department. I'm in the Department of Psychology, or whatever it's called now. In terms of training, I'm actually a cognitive scientist. I consider myself to be a cognitive scientist, not a psychologist. And the difference is that cognitive science is more interdisciplinary. And if you look at the kind of work I do, you'll find that there's a lot of computer science in it. There's a lot of philosophy also in it. Occasionally, I've published in philosophy journals, for example. And so I don't just do psychology to understand how the mind works. I also do computer modeling, and I think about the, philosophical issues that are involved, which is actually very important in the context of understanding science denial, or why people reject science, and why we can say that that is probably not such a good way to understand reality.
So you've jumped straight into it to let people know this area of interest that we're talking about is, I'm going to paraphrase it, and then I'll probably butcher it, and then you can clean it all up. So I read about you and found out about you, and the way I interpret as a caveman, which is my area of speciality, what you do is your area of interest and research is, I kind of look at it as twofold, and you can, again, correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm slightly skewed. When people just won't believe the science, that's one of the areas you look into. But I think even more interestingly, as I read it, when someone has a belief or they have a thought process that believes something, and when they're presented with the scientific evidence that shows that they're wrong, and it's maybe the opposite view or a different view as the truth, they still choose to stick with the belief rather than go, oh, the science says this, so I need to change my beliefs. And one of the reasons I'm excited about this, and I said this to you before we started, and people who watch and listen to me understand that I have a bit of an affinity with the flat earthers, and no matter what you show them, they hang on to their beliefs. But in this current climate, especially with what's happening in America and here in New Zealand and around the world, with people like not taking on board the need to wear masks and what COVID really is, I just think this is the most pertinent conversation at the most pertinent time possibly we're ever going to have on this podcast. So there, you can hear I'm excited. So have I got the research interest basically right? What do we need to tweak to explain to people what you do?
Yeah, no, spot on.
So tell us, I mean, why does that happen? Why do people, when given unchallengeable scientific truths and proofs, still choose to stick with their beliefs?
Well, first of all, I got to correct you on that one, because science doesn't offer proof. It offers evidence.
Okay.
And I think that's very important to be aware of that, because intriguingly, one of the interesting techniques of people who reject scientific evidence is to ask for proof. That's one of their techniques, is to say, well, can you prove to me that climate change exists? And the answer to that is, well, no, of course not. It's not a matter of proof. It's a matter of evidence. There is no proof outside of mathematics. So, and it's kind of important to get that right, because otherwise, when a climate denier, quote unquote, says, oh, I want proof, then you might be tempted to try and give it to them. Well, you can't. And that is where they're wrong to begin with, because by asking for proof, they're already basically disqualifying themselves from a scientific debate, because in science, the best you can do is to produce evidence. And pile evidence on top of evidence on top of evidence, and then ultimately you get to the point where we say that something is a fact, such as climate change, for example, where the evidence is so overwhelming that not accepting it is just not a rational position to take. Now, when I say rational, what I mean by that is rational in the very strict sense of how philosophers have worked out that we should consider evidence. And so the question then is, as you already asked, why do people not accept the evidence? What is it that makes them say, oh, no, I want proof, even though there is a pile of evidence in front of their eyes? And the answer is that instead of engaging in this quote unquote rational evidence accumulation process, people resort to what we call motivated cognition. Now, motivated cognition is a very broad term, and it refers to the idea that people start out with a goal in their head of what they're trying to conclude, and they will then draw that conclusion. They'll be motivated to draw that conclusion no matter what the evidence says.
Right.
And now the question is, okay, what makes people engage in motivated cognition? And that's where things get to be very interesting, because there's a lot of ways in which that can happen. In the context of climate change, and indeed in most situations I've looked at, what triggers people's motivated cognition is the conflict between their personal worldview and the scientific evidence. So basically, it's ideology versus evidence. And that is why when you look at climate denial around the world, it doesn't really matter where you go, although it's most pronounced in Australia, the UK, and the US. What you find is that what determines people's attitudes towards climate change is their attitudes towards the free market. If they're libertarian or free market fundamentalists or conservatives who think that, business should be laissez-faire, free enterprise, that cluster of attitudes, if people subscribe to that strongly, then chances are that they will reject the evidence from climate change. I can ask people 4 or 5 questions about the free market, and once I know their answers, my uncertainty about their climate change belief is cut in half.
Right.
Which is incredible.
Right. So you can probe them in a different area and say, well, because they've answered this here, like
Precisely.
a free market economy, they're likely to believe this here.
Precisely.
Wow.
Precisely. And the association is incredibly strong. And if you think about it, that's not surprising, because if you accept the scientific evidence about climate change, then we're going to have to do something and change the way we do business. And that means we got to put a price on carbon. We might need taxes, regulations. There might be some, some industries like the coal industry, for example, is going to go out of business. There's no question. So there'll be a massive transformation of the economy in ways that are not compatible with the sort of fundamentalist approach to free market economics. And so you have that conflict. And some people's identity is so tied up in their free market beliefs that they get incredibly challenged by the claims that the climate is changing, that we have to do something about it. And it becomes a very deep emotional response. And their way of defending their identity against that is by simply denying the science. They just say, well, you haven't proven it to me. There's no proof. Hence, I can walk away from it. For example, there's lots of other ways in which they do it. But the motivating factor is ideology.
Do you think that I was going to say we're splitting hairs? I don't mean we're splitting hairs in a I'm not trying to undermine anything, but because you're coming from an academic position, the idea of evidence and proof, whereas for most of us laymen, when we say where's the proof, we're kind of saying where's the evidence, even though we might be using the wrong words. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yes, and that's fine. And but if you're asking me about proof, then I have to clarify that that's not really what it's about. I mean, proof is something that's inescapable for logical reasons. That's what a proof is. It's like in maths, you can prove something, but in the real world, it's all about having evidence. And yes, the evidence can be so strong that it would be perverse not to believe it. That is actually Stephen Jay Gould coined that term. He said a fact is something that is so well established that it would be perverse to withhold at least provisional assent to that fact. So, but we always have to understand that there are degrees of evidence, and that our knowledge, some knowledge is rock solid, like gravity. We don't debate gravity.
You'd be surprised.
Well, we also don't debate that the Earth is round.
Well, you'd be surprised again by some.
The fact that there are some people who are in a different space when it comes to that. But the point is that there's no scientific uncertainty about that, and actually there's none about climate change either. We know it's happening, and we know that we're causing it, and it's not going to be all good. So those three facts are actually not under dispute scientifically.
So would it be fair to kind of assert, you've talked about mathematics. I mean, it's easy to prove that 2 + 2 is 4. But once something becomes unquestionable, like there has to be an absolute to be proof, is that what you're saying? And if there's 1/10 of 1% of an idea of, possibly a different outcome, then we stick with the idea of mounting evidence rather than the term proof.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the Earth is round is not a matter of proof. It's a matter of evidence. And the fact that the Earth is revolving around the sun is it's not something I can prove. It is just something where all the evidence tells us that. And in certain cases, very many cases actually, the strength of evidence is such that it is indistinguishable almost from a mathematical proof,
right.
Such as that the Earth is flat, and, not round rather, and that there's gravity and the planetary motions. I mean, that stuff we don't debate. It's kind of like, that's just the way it is, and no one disputes it because it's a waste of time.
You used the phrase before, and I'm scribing away down here as you're talking. One of the reasons, and again, I'm going to obviously be caveman layman here, but talking about one of the reasons people hold on to their beliefs rather than go with the science, the evidence, is motivated cognition. As you're saying that, I'm thinking that sort of sounds like what some layman might say, a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like we want to see it, so we make it happen and we stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of components to this. The fundamental principle is that people think to achieve an outcome rather than follow the evidence. That's what motivated cognition means. And so that means that it doesn't matter what evidence you present to somebody who's committed to the position, for example, that climate change doesn't exist. It doesn't matter what you would, if they're not satisfied yet by the evidence that exists, then they never will be. It's a complete, there's no connection between their thinking and the state of the evidence. And that, of course, is deeply problematic if that then translates into political currency, into political movements that are blocking mitigation efforts for climate change. So we can't just walk away from this and say, oh, well, some people just don't believe it. Well, once it turns into a political force, then it is much harder to ignore that. And that's when we have to start understanding why this happens. And we then have to try and find ways of dealing with that.
I guess as well, when you're talking about, and you were talking about those who believe in the free market, or I guess who believe in it more fervently, are more fervently likely to be climate change deniers. I guess that's therefore you can also politically say, well, obviously people who believe in that style of economics are also right-wingers, therefore right-wingers are more likely to disregard climate change. And although that might spread the group, and there are people like within the New Zealand right that they call blue-greens who accept the science of climate change, but they're still, it's like 100% of the people who are libertarians are on the right. So it's easier then to look at all of the right and go, well, you are the guys who don't accept climate change, and look at the left, and I'm talking politically speaking, and go, you are the guys who do. So you get bigger groups to then label with that same disbelief.
You're right. I mean, I can substitute my free market questions with an inventory of people's political attitudes, and if I then separate them into liberals versus conservatives or whatever the distinction in Australia, that doesn't work too well because the Liberal Party in Australia is actually conservative. So you got to be careful. The left-right division, you get the same results because there's a strong association between conservatism and endorsement of free markets. And so you have this conflict in that case. And what's interesting is that sort of association between politics and science denial is surprisingly widespread. For example, if you look at attitudes towards vaccinations, you get the same result. People on the political right, at least in the United States, are less likely to endorse vaccinations than people on the political left. And if you look at why that is, then you very quickly run into the same idea, namely libertarianism and the idea that the government shouldn't control what happens to my children, or that the government shouldn't tell me how to lead my life. And hence vaccinations are being rejected because they're seen as an intrusion into parental autonomy.
Although in that one, I'm interested because obviously you've done the work. I think about the political spectrum maybe not being so much of a linear, but more, like
a horseshoe.
Yeah, and I think of the people I know who reject vaccinations. I hear what you're saying about the libertarian on the right, but also the far left, when people are like, I don't put aluminium in my body and these sorts of things. It seems that for that particular, shall we call it a conspiracy theory or a position or opinion, that the far left and the far right can kind of hold equal footing in that. From the research that you've looked at or what you've looked into, is it an even spread or is it still more on the far right than the far left?
That's a very interesting question because I think anecdotally, you're absolutely right. And in fact, right now, when you look at COVID and you're looking at these demonstrations around the world against masks or against, God knows, social distancing and all that, people who say COVID is a hoax, that's a very eclectic, interesting mix of people who can be from the extreme left as well as from the extreme right. Now, so yes, the extremes might mingle up on these occasions. But what's interesting is that in the data, when I take 1,000 Americans or U.S. residents, and I look at their attitudes and I try to find out how they respond to scientific evidence, then in those samples, those representative large samples, those extreme left people just don't show up because there are hardly any of them. So you don't sweep up a lot of extreme leftists if you get 1,000 representative Americans. You might get one or two, but you will sweep up about 100 or so extreme right-wingers in a representative sample in the U.S. of 1,000. There is a very large right-wing tail in the United States. So they will be in my samples, as they should be, because they actually are numerically larger than the extreme left. And that's why then, everything is, the result is that the right wing, the extreme right wing, is denying climate change and is reluctant about vaccinations. And God knows, the link between tobacco and lung cancer. There's a lot of scientific issues that I've looked at and other colleagues have looked at where the extreme right is less likely to endorse the science than people on the left. And sure, there may be a handful of extreme leftists who show up at the same demonstrations as the right wingers, but there aren't enough to actually show up in the data when you do a systematic survey. So you have to be very careful about, this is actually an interesting scientific point. You have to be very careful about whether you go with the sort of anecdotes, the appearance of left-wingers at demonstrations, or whether you go with the data. And especially in the context of vaccination, that's been very interesting because there was a time when very reputable journalists, in fact, a friend of mine, Chris Mooney, made claims that vaccine denial was the climate denial of the left. based on
Right.
appearance,
Right.
based on the fact that some of the spokespeople were sort of left-wingish. But it doesn't show up in the data. So you have to be very careful about not mistaking anecdotes, individual people who you can listen to or who you see at demonstrations, to mistake that for what is really happening in the population. Because the only way you can understand that is by sampling representative samples and look at what people believe.
I also think you are saying anecdotal. I mean, when I hear that, I think like an individual's experience versus what the data says, so to speak. Exactly. There are unquestionably, I guess, though, still those on the far left for the vaccine one in particular.
Sure.
But I also wonder if it's still a mindset of why they fight against that, and I wonder if the libertarians on the right fight against it, as you're saying, like, keep the government out of my parenting decision, small government, I'm not going to do what you tell me to, especially in the American system, whereas those on the far left are more about, from their perspective, I know, and this is just me saying from people I know in that thing, it's more about them and their own health and what they do want to do to their own body. So it seems like maybe the right, when they fight against that one, would be more an institutional battle, whereas the far left, about that particular one, they're more doing it from an ironically individual liberties kind of position, perhaps.
Quite possibly. Yes, quite possibly. The other thing we have to talk about, if we talk about science denial, is conspiracy theories, because you scratch the surface a little when you talk to somebody who is rejecting well-established scientific facts. And you'll find a conspiracy theorist sooner or later. I mean, I can almost promise you that. You just, spend a few minutes, kind of ask a few questions, and ultimately you get to the conspiracy very quickly. And that is important to understand, because dealing with people who believe in conspiracy theories is challenging, because by definition, a conspiracy theory is a self-sealing edifice. In other words, a conspiracy theory is designed to turn any contrary evidence into evidence for the theory, as well as the absence of evidence, turning that into evidence for the conspiracy theory. So by the time you get to a conspiracy theory, you got a completely closed bubble, sort of like a Mr. Beanish epistemic bubble, where there's only one person inside, or one theory, and everything else finds no admission. And that's important to understand. And I think it is illustrative for others who do not fall into this rabbit hole to analyze and understand, how conspiracy theories work, and why, scientists can't subscribe to these conspiracy theories, because they're just in total conflict with the way scientific evidence is normally used. Let me give you an example a couple examples that I find really illuminating when we talk about that. The first one is the turning the absence of evidence into evidence for a conspiracy theory.
Sure.
There was a case recently, a few months ago, this year, in the context of COVID, where some person on YouTube made the claim that, this virus is a Chinese biological weapon, and it was created by some lab in Wuhan, and that that famous epidemiologist Fauci in the United States, you may have heard of him. He's all over the news.
Yeah.
He's sort of the godfather of epidemiology in the United States. Fauci had connection to that lab, and he sent millions of taxpayer dollars to that lab to develop this virus. Now it's crazy talk, frankly. We shouldn't waste any time on that. Except what's very interesting in this case is that the person was asked to provide evidence for that. Where's the evidence that Fauci has done this? He doesn't have access to money. How would he do that? And the answer was, there is no evidence. That's the whole point. The cover-up is so good that they're hiding their traces and there is no evidence. Now that's a remarkable thought process if you think about it, because that's saying, I have a hypothesis that has zero support and evidence, therefore it must be true.
Well, the other thing you sometimes hear, and actually, shockingly, I heard this. I watch a lot of American politics. I heard this from either a congressperson or a senator in the last month or so. That runs alongside what you've just explained, is when people say, "Well, where's the evidence for that?" and they say, "Well, where's the evidence it didn't happen?" You know, that's the other line that often conspiracy theorists will take. I had a conversation with my lovely flat Earth friends the other day, and I explained how if the ice wall around the outside of the world is Antarctica, yet Antarctica's in daylight for 24 hours a day for 3 months of the year, then the whole flat disk would be in daylight, because that's how light travels, and tens of thousands of people witness this every year because there are tours to Antarctica. And straight away the first answer was, that doesn't happen. And the second answer was, yeah, but have they been into space and seen the moon? I mean, seen the globe for themselves. So it was there was first a massive change, and we'll leave that point that you've just made aside, because I can't argue. We'll change the point to something else. But then it's also often there's no evidence it hasn't happened or it doesn't happen, and as I guess most people will be aware of, it's very difficult to prove a negative.
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course. I mean, I can just confabulate something, a hallucination, and I can say, there's a pink elephant in the corner over there, and then I can say, well, you can't prove to me it's not there, therefore it is there.
Yeah.
That's sort of, I mean, that's one of many.
I think the point
illogical fallacies.
I think the point you made, which is really, really, really important for us to hear, and I've heard this recently, is in fact I heard it listening to a debate online between a Christian and an atheist, and it was the atheist who said to the Christian, and you've been saying it, but I just want to reiterate to people listening and watching how important this is, that the absence of my evidence doesn't mean that what you're saying is true. Like, if I can't prove, or I don't have the evidence to suffice your question, it doesn't mean your question therefore is right.
Sure, because they're completely unconnected, I guess. That's the point. Yeah.
But I think often in these conversations as well, the conspiracy conversations, people look for evidence, or as we've been saying earlier, they look for proof, but I guess they're looking for evidence for something to be it. And if they can't be handed it, they go, well, there, see, told you. But the absence of that doesn't necessarily mean you're right.
Yeah. Well, that's one of many fallacies. The other one that I like is incoherence. I don't know if you've come across that, but most conspiracy theories, and for that matter, science denial, is incoherent. So let me give you one example again with COVID. That's a real example that was quite, intriguing. Again, on YouTube, some video making claims about COVID, and the same person initially said, well, actually, COVID has been with us since we were children. And we got this virus through vaccinations.
Oh, God.
And the reason we're now having COVID is because it was triggered by us wearing masks. Now, that's, of course, nonsense 1, 2, and 3. There's nothing, absolutely zero validity to any of this. But a few minutes later, the same person said, oh, well, COVID was a chemical weapon or a biological weapon that was released by a Chinese lab in January of this year by accident. And it's kind of like, what? I mean, either the first nonsense is true or the second nonsense. Now, of course, neither is true. But the thing is, you can't believe both at the same time because they're mutually incompatible. And that, I think, is very important to recognize, because that is something that tells you, or anybody who's now listening, or anybody who's encountering a conspiracy theorist, that is a hint, a very strong cue that tells you that that person cannot be right. Whatever they're saying, something is wrong because it can't be incoherent. And you see that in science denial. Let me give you an example from climate denial, one of my favorite examples. We've actually, incidentally, cataloged about 250 inconsistencies or incoherent attitudes among climate deniers. The one that I like the best is somebody saying, oh, well, we don't even know what the global temperature is because we can't measure it. These thermometers are just not reliable enough. We don't, and then a second later, they say, oh, but by the way, don't worry about global warming because it's been cooling for the last 10 years. Well, how do you know that if you can't measure temperature, right? That's completely incoherent. And yet people will say that sort of, they'll juxtapose completely incoherent ideas without detecting the incoherence. And that's inevitable. Because if you're denying well-established science, you cannot do that and be coherent. Because if there were a coherent alternative, the scientists would have proposed it. They would be debating it. But these are sort of markers of flawed cognition that is motivated rather than evidence-driven. And once you understand that as a member of the public, you at least have a tool to sift the noise from the signal.
It also makes me think as well, if it's a cognition issue, that it actually, the way you've described it gives me a sense of more empathy towards these people who aren't able to then make the leap for their own good. One of the things I was going to say to you is, COVID's a good example, right? And it's very pertinent. The science is there, and the science is as good as it's doing at the moment is there to help us beat this thing, help us get through this thing. So those who are denying it, who are fighting against it, are actually harming themselves or potentially harming themselves. I mean, we're very lucky.
And others.
Very true, very true. But one of the things that I'm fascinated with is that belief, whatever it is, and I've been sitting here thinking as you've been talking, because I often think religion has a big part to play in this, and I grew up Catholic, so often when I think religion, I think of sort of the Christian belief, and I was thinking, because quite often you can think about these things and lay them at the feet of Christians as well, but actually I know lots of people who are Christians who are completely on board with climate change, and so actually it feels like the religion thing is actually less relevant to, again, the free market thing, because it's the conservative Christians that are in this field, not Christians. And I imagine, I don't know too much about any other religions.
No,
but yeah.
There's data on that and on how religion affects climate attitudes. And it's not at all straightforward. There is a whole Christian tradition of stewardship for the earth, and the Pope published an encyclical, whatever it's called, a couple of years ago, where he made that point, that we have to take climate change seriously because of our duty to care for the earth. Religion is a very mixed bag, and I wouldn't necessarily identify that as it's also true for COVID. But let me talk a bit more about COVID and the
just to jump back to that question I was going to ask, which is about when the science is there to help us and our beliefs potentially harm us, and as you say, harm people around us. That seems even a bigger step to going, I'm going to stick with my beliefs. COVID's a good example. Sure. I mean, we hear about, in the religious world, we hear about people, not wanting to give their children blood transfusions and that sort of thing. But maybe we sit with COVID because it is so relevant at the moment. But it's like voting against your own self-interest. It's like, I will choose to stick with what this person has told me. That becomes my belief. I'm in the free market sector of society. I'm not going to wear a mask. Oh, granddad just died.
Yeah. Well, I think, let's talk about that, because first of all, we have to establish that people who are who believe in COVID-related conspiracy theories are less likely to comply with social distancing measures and other guidelines and mask wearing and all that. Of course, it's unsurprising, but yes, that has been established in a number of studies and is very very clear. So the question then is, what's going on here? Why are people engaging in these conspiracy theories? And this brings me to another trigger for this kind of motivated cognition, which isn't ideology or worldview. but is people's feeling of uncertainty and loss of control. And one of the things that we know, or that we have observed over centuries actually, is that a pandemic will always trigger a sense of loss of control. People will feel that, they can't control their future. They're scared. They're uncertain. They don't know what's going to happen in the future.
But that's appropriate.
And whenever,
I mean, that's the appropriate response, because they have no control and they can't control their future.
Exactly.
So that's actually the correct response.
Exactly. Well, I mean, having that feeling is completely understandable.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
This is nasty. This is not something we signed up for. We didn't sort of kind of say, hey, let's make 2020 a Corona year. Yeah. That wasn't really what we signed up for. But the question then is, how do you respond to that? How do you deal with that uncertainty? What can you do? And it turns out that for a certain number of people, that loss of control and uncertainty is a trigger for them to engage in conspiracy theories. And that happens with pandemics with alarming regularity. It also happens with other traumatic events. Any mass shooting in the US is followed by conspiracy theories. When Princess Diana died in a car crash, that triggered conspiracy theories because it was a frightening, uncontrolled, random event that gave people that unsettling feeling and also grief, over the loss of this beautiful woman and all the mystique that went with her. And whenever that happens, some people resort to conspiracy theories. And they do that because it gives them comfort. And this is an ironic consequence of belief in conspiracy theories, that you can then explain the world as being bad because of bad people. And somehow that's more comforting than to accept that something can happen at random. COVID was caused in all likelihood by some bat in a cave sneezing on a dude. And all of a sudden, society is turned upside down because of that. Now, I'm comfortable accepting that. Or, that's our best guess. Something like that happened in China. I'm comfortable with that. That happens. And in fact, it happens all the time, and we should have known, and we should have been prepared, et cetera, et cetera. But for other people, that's a very frightening thing to accept. They'd much rather say that Bill Gates is trying to implant microchips into our head. Because then you can blame it on Bill Gates. And the moment you can blame it on a person, you have this weird sense of empowerment, because you can at least imagine that person might not be bad, and then the world would be a better place. So there's some literature that suggests that having enemies and having conspiracy theories with bad people at the core of it, that provides some sort of chicken soup for the soul, some sort of comforting comfort.
I wonder as well, because we're a species who likes a narrative. We have our art, we have our storytelling. We like a movie that wraps up well at the end. So therefore, when we come to that moment in our lives where it is uncontrollable and unknowable, we fill it with a story, and that story is the conspiracy theory. In other words, we need something to explain the situation as to what's going on. It's uncontrollable and unexplainable. So it's like I'm watching a program on Netflix at the moment called The Curse of Oak Island. And it's these guys looking for treasure, and all these stories about this treasure that could be buried on Oak Island. And I noticed very clearly everything they find and everything they see points towards the treasure. Now, if you didn't know there was treasure there, it would just be a rock, or it would just be a spent cartridge from the 1800s, because obviously there was people living there. But they find stuff, and when they find it, they're like, well, this is really interesting, and this points towards the story being true. So because they have that mindset you talked about before, the motivated cognition, they're looking for what they know now and what they find from there on in to point back to them finding this treasure on this island. Similar sort of thing, I think.
Yeah, I don't know that show, but it sounds like it's fun. To be honest, talking about this does have some entertainment value. It's not like that this is completely boring. And that, in fact, to be honest, is almost the problem, because I think quite a few people out there are looking at the stuff and these various conspiracy theories, and they get a chuckle out of it, and then they forward it to their friends and say, ha ha ha, look over here. The problem with that is that makes it more visible, and the more visible you make these conspiracy theories, the more likely it is that people get entrapped in them, and that they sort of say, oh, that could be right. And then, you get into this community, into this cult, which is really what it is. The psychology of cults and the psychology of conspiracy theorists can be quite similar for the hardcore committed conspiracy theorists. And so, and the moment people are in that situation, it has quite considerable negative consequences for themselves, but also for their loved ones. They're now, there are increasing reports of people whose relatives are caught up in one of these conspiracy theories, and for them it's a tragic loss, because they can no longer communicate with those people, because in the extreme case, they're in this bubble that is just completely disconnected from reality and interpret it in a completely different way.
I also discovered, and you've sort of touched on this already. Some, as you say, it's a bit of fun. It can be a bit of fun. Some conspiracy theories are fun, and they're fun to talk about. I mean, it doesn't really harm anyone in the world, I don't think, if one doesn't believe that the moon landing happened. Even the flat Earth one, on some levels, it's not really a big deal. But I then figured out that when hanging out, I've had 2 flat earthers on the podcast. That's why I sort of have in some Facebook groups and stuff. But then I found out we had a tragic massacre here in New Zealand where 51 people were gunned down by a right-wing white neo-national guy in Christchurch.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, those same people who believed that there's no moon, there was no landing, the Earth's flat, they then flipped into, and this is a shooting done by the government. This is a false flag operation. And I was just like, okay, hang on. This is one step too far. And then, as you say, they're the ones who then don't believe in COVID and vaccinations. And it's almost like, in the days of gone past, they used to talk about it's a gateway drug. It's like, okay, so the flat Earth and the moon landing is a gateway conspiracy theory to not believing in COVID and taking it into the rest home where your granddad is.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to support what you just said, which is that if somebody believes in one conspiracy theory, that is a very strong predictor that they also believe in other conspiracy theories. So absolutely, once you're in this cluster, chances are that there will be other theories that people believe, because, they for some people, not everybody, but for some people, conspiracy theories are something that, they're predisposed to believe that because of their cognitive style and their predisposition towards, magical thinking or relying on intuition as an indicator of truth rather than evidence. If you ask people these questions, you sometimes get very surprising answers, like, it feels right to me, therefore it has to be true.
Yeah.
And
believe
that's more
your
important
senses.
to me. It's a sort of feeling-based cognition. So yeah, totally. That there's no doubt that these attitudes cluster together. Now, one thing about that is, another thing I want to add is that fortunately, not everybody who articulates a conspiracy theory is in fact that committed to it and is one of those people who will believe every conspiracy that's out there. And I've got some research underway where I show that. And basically what I show in one of my studies is that you can trigger conspiratorial rhetoric in people who are not predisposed to conspiracies by creating a situation where things challenge their worldview. In other words, people who are libertarians, again, and who are challenged by climate change, they will resort to conspiratorial explanations of the scientific consensus because it allows them to get off the hook. They could just
Yeah,
make a
right.
throwaway comment. Oh, the scientists are in it for the money.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and then
Right.
that means I can fly to Bali on my next holiday. But the same people wouldn't do that when it comes to explaining the scientific consensus on other issues such as AIDS, HIV, and AIDS. You know, sure, if you're a conspiracy theorist, you'll deny that link, but it's not triggered by your libertarianism in the way it is for climate change. So there is a very selective use of conspiratorial rhetoric that people engage in basically to get off the hook,
Right.
because they don't then have to accept the scientific evidence. Now, the reason I think that's conceivably good news is because we know it is extremely difficult to deal with people who are deep down the conspiratorial rabbit hole, because they will interpret any evidence in favor of the theory, no matter what it says. They will not listen to government sources, official sources, scientific evidence. They're not interested in that. So they're extremely difficult to reach. But that doesn't mean everybody who articulates a conspiracy theory is that difficult to reach. There's a lot of people who deploy that just because it's kind of, it's a throwaway comment. And we have data to suggest that. We have data to suggest that actually, in many cases, you can convince people otherwise. Not everybody is immune to evidence. And I think that's important to sort of close on that. We're sort of running out of time a bit.
Look, let me ask you this, Professor. It's exactly
Sure.
what I was going to say. We've only got maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. But those
Sure.
of us who are sitting on the outside and have gone past the fact of, look at these silly COVID deniers, and actually going, these guys are really in danger, and they're putting their families in danger and us in danger on some level. What can we do when when we believe the science and they have a personal ideology or belief? How do you cut through that and I don't know if you can even convince them, but get them to understand what the truth is and maybe what they're missing for their own sake and the sake of everybody else?
Yeah. Well, very good point. I mean, I think, first of all, you got to pick your audience, and you got to know who you're talking to. I tend not to talk to people who are conspiracy theorists or climate deniers because, what's the point? I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in convincing them. That is not my goal. My goal is to talk to as many people as possible who are not susceptible to falling into these traps, and to explain to them why there are these people out there who have those beliefs, how you can tell that those beliefs are flawed just based on their incoherence, for example, and thus to protect the large majority of the public against falling for nonsense. That I think, to my mind, is the most important communicative effort we can expend, is to talk to the people who just have to be backed up a little and are, give them some support. And they're actually okay, but we just got to strengthen their belief in themselves, that they're able to resist these illogical and incoherent conspiracy theories. So that, for starters, I think is crucial.
I think I think that's an idea that goes really well when we're talking about society. Like we don't debate, don't debate the deniers, don't do this, don't do that. But like if it's, and I don't have anyone in my family like this, but if it was my brother, and if I had a vested interest in them, if it was a parent of mine who was ignoring it, so they're going out without masks, so we do have a vested interest. Do you have any advice in that kind of area as well?
Well, again, that's when it becomes much more complicated. If you're personally involved with the person who holds these beliefs and who is engaging in actions that are harmful to themselves or others, well, then again, it depends on who that person is and how far they are down the rabbit hole and committed to this. If they're an extreme case and they're committed to this theory and it's part of their identity, and you're threatening their identity whenever you try to talk them out of it, then you're not going to be very successful, and you may be in for a very painful experience. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it may end up that your relationship suffers with people like that. There's enough evidence to suggest that does happen. The family of cult members, there's a lot of literature on that they suffer a great deal because they effectively lose a person who's when they go too far down this rabbit hole. So I can't offer much, solace. However, there is a gray zone in between before people become so extremely committed, where what the research suggests is that you can still have a conversation with these people, and the literature on de-radicalization of extremists and terrorists suggests that it's a long-term process. You got to build a rapport. You got to show empathy. You got to be, sympathetic to the fact that they, gee, that's interesting. You're holding these beliefs. Hey, why don't we both go on a journey of discovery and look at the evidence together? That sort of approach is known to be more successful than confrontation.
So walking with rather than confronting confront. Walking
yeah,
with
a total kind of like, you're an idiot, and how could anybody believe that? And that doesn't. People don't like to be told that. It's kind of weird. It's kind of funny that they don't respond well to that. But by the same token, you also can't agree with them. So you have to find a way to negotiate this territory and to say, well, I respect that people can come to different beliefs, but why don't we go on this journey of discovery together, and then over time, if you can invest the time, there is an opportunity for success, but it's not going to be easy.
All right.
Unfortunately.
I think, so it sounds like what you're saying is some people are beyond that approach, and the best idea is to get to people before they get so tribal in their beliefs. Because we get so tribal in our beliefs that we're never going to let them go no matter what. And I, as I said a couple of times, basically me having fun with some flat earthers, I've seen that. And actually, if I now think about if that person was a family member and we were talking about vaccines, that would be a much scarier proposition. So yeah, getting them before they're down that final rabbit hole and walking alongside them rather than confronting them as an idiot.
I think that's the best we can do.
Hey, Professor Stephan Lewandowsky, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it immensely, and hopefully for people out there, this has been somewhat useful. All the way from Berlin, thank you for joining us. I guess we say Auf Wiedersehen, don't we?
Okay, yeah, or tschüss. That's the colloquial. Ciao. Bye.